Thank you, Kirsten. Thank you, Marili. Don't forget, the souvenirs are waiting you right next to stage. The thank you souvenirs. Yeah, I have to say thank you for an idea. Now I will always say that I don't look posh just because I'm sustainable, not because I'm messy. Yeah, next up. Oh, I saw that a lot of you are taking pictures and videos. Yeah, please do use the hashtag Act for Impact and Impact Day. And please do give us a feedback. Just scan the QR code and we would be really grateful if you did so, because we want to be better next year. We want to adapt. But now, next speaker is joining us virtually. And he is Timothée Parrique. He's a researcher in ecological economics at Lund University in Sweden. Expert in degrowth, he's an author of, and excuse my French, Ralentir ou périr l'économie de la décroissance, and a book based on his PhD thesis, The Political Economy of Degrowth. Welcome to stage, or should I say on screen, Timothée Parrique.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you, even though I cannot be here physically. I will try as best as I can to welcome you in the research work that I've been doing in the last few years. So as of now, you should be able to see my slide appearing. Or should you? Fantastic. It has appeared, and I wanted to open with this slide, which some of you may remember that film from 1995, Jumanji. Do you remember Jumanji? So it's a magical game and you start playing it and then you get absorbed into the game. And then you get locked inside of Jumanji. And the only way to get out of Jumanji is to play the rules of the game and to manage somehow to win. In this talk, I'm going to talk about sustainability, but I want to bring you into a more concrete claim. And my claim is that we will have tremendous difficulty to face sustainability challenges if we stay stuck within the rule of the current economic game. And this is why I have titled this talk Escape from Capitalism, because I think before we can really tackle sustainability issues, we need to talk about the economy we're currently playing. And this is what I've been exploring since my PhD thesis, which I started in 2016, which is on the left. And for those of you that like to read very, very long PDF in theoretical economics, you will find it online. I've tried to sum it up into a sexier book, which will soon be translated into different languages. Slow Down or Perish, which you can see on the right. And it all starts from a figure which I'm sure you're going to see repeatedly during these days, planetary boundaries. This is the latest update from a few weeks ago. What is that telling us? It's telling us something we already know. We are overshooting planetary boundaries, which mean as a species, all of us on Earth are just overusing and overpassing the carrying capacity of ecosystems. But what's most interesting is to actually look at the national level for these planetary boundaries, which you can do in many studies that have just applied them at a local level. And when we do that, we realize that we are not all on the same boats. So countries have different degrees of environmental impact. You see the UK, well, basically all high-income countries that have huge degrees of ecological overshoot. That's all the red you can see around the green ring. And you see poorer countries which have not yet crossed their planetary boundaries. The main point I want you to take from this talk is that there are huge degrees of environmental inequalities. And so when we're talking about an ecological transition, that necessarily imply proportional, gradual, adapted, contextual strategies from different places in the world and also from different places within one single country. That number about carbon inequality is very symbolic. So when you look on the right, you see that the top 10% richest individuals on Earth, that's roughly 780 million people, are responsible for 48% of global emissions. So basically half of all emissions on Earth. These people, they also own 76% of world wealth. They're very wealthy people. And they will be confronted with only 3% of the cost of climate change. If you shift to the left of the graph, you see that it's a different situation for the bottom 50% poorest half of humanity, which we're talking about roughly 4 billion people. These people, they only own 2% of world wealth, so basically nothing. They emit only 12% of global emissions, so on a per capita basis, nothing compared to the top 10%. But these people, the most vulnerable, will have to face 75% of the cost of climate change. So this is, for me, the start of my work, to have to find two different strategies. One strategy for the people on the right and another strategy for the people and country on the left. And I'm going to show you how it looks. Another number important, because that was a static showing you basically what's happening today. But when we look at historical emissions and use of natural resources, we also realize that different stories of development have had different ecological footprints. So for example, on the left, you see historical responsibilities towards global greenhouse emissions since 1850, which, no surprises here, to a degree of almost, more than 90% is the responsibility of high-income countries. That responsibility we find also when we look at the use of natural resources in the sense of material footprint, so biomass, minerals, metals, and fossil fuel. Here we have 74%. So also in the way we think about sustainability strategy, we need to take into account not only static today's responsibility, let's say proportional responsibility, but also take into account the whole trail of environmental impact that has been left by different pathways of development. I'm a French economist. I've been trying to disguise my French accent so far, but believe me, I can come back to a more genuine way of speaking if you desire so. And so here's my country, a perfect example of complete ecological overshoot, which has started at least since the 1960s and 70s. And so now in France, we are one of the countries that somehow have been trying for at least a few decades to reduce that total ecological footprint, but we have not managed to do so. And so that opens an interesting research question to be like, okay, if the things we've been trying until now have not managed to invert the curve, meaning not to just increase ecological footprint, but to start to decrease it, what else could we be trying? Many people will tell you about green growth and the fact that you can decouple the use of natural resources from economic activity or gross domestic product. This we've been studying very carefully, and only a handful of countries in the world have managed to achieve some kind of absolute decoupling. So absolute decoupling meaning to see both an increase in GDP and a decrease in that graph of greenhouse gases. The problem is, first and foremost, it's not only about carbon. This is so important. When you hear about sustainability, think biodiversity, soil, water, e-waste, climate stability, ocean acidification, use of nitrogen and phosphorus, not only carbon. Again, planetary boundary is a complex, holistic framework of sustainability where these ecosystems interact. So we must not dumb down that challenge to only one single environmental metric, which is the one of carbon, which we've been doing for the last decades. And this is also why many countries claim to have achieved green growth just because they've slightly decarbonized their economy. So this is what they look like. This is a study that was published a few weeks ago that looked at the 11 countries in the world that have managed to do that, increase GDP and decrease greenhouse gas emissions. And these countries have tended to claim that they've achieved green growth and therefore that problem was kind of solved. The truth is that that reduction must be measured against specific environmental objectives. I mean, sustainability works like this. I'm coming back to planetary boundaries. You see the little red overshoot. The goal is to get back within the green. If you just trim like a couple of millimeters of CO2 emissions, that doesn't give you sustainability. That only gives you like a gold star you can put on the fridge to be proud in front of other government members or people in your company. But the climate, that does not stabilize it. To stabilize it, we need to get back in the green. To, get back into sustainable use of phosphorus and nitrogen, we need to get back into the green. So that's what getting back into the green looks like in terms of carbon emissions. In gray, you can see what we've been doing from 2013 to 2019, extended into 2022 in these 11 countries. Each country is a curve. The red is the projected 11 curves in dotted lines, and the average in a slightly larger dotted line if we continue on the course we're having. That pathway is not sustainable at all, since we will reach near carbon neutrality in a matter of 220 years, and in doing so overshoot these national countries' carbon budget by almost a factor of 30. So what we need as a sustainable course of decarbonization are these scary blue curves. They're scary because they're so fast. And they go so fast, almost a 90-degree turn compared to historical decreases. So if you want to show that basically you can both continue to grow your economy, meaning producing and consuming more, while polluting less, you need to show how we can create that blue curve and argue that somehow we're going to be able to start creating that blue curve starting tomorrow or even today. If you cannot show this, then it means you cannot demonstrate the feasibility of green growth. And that leaves you only one option. That's an idea I've been developing in my PhD thesis and in the book, and that's the idea of degrowth towards a steady state economy. And basically, I like to explain it like this. We've seen in terms of planetary boundary that growing our economies, meaning producing and consuming more, which we've been doing in high-income countries over decades, has led us to a state of ecological overshoot. That's the curve, goes over the planetary boundaries. Now we are at the first dotted line, and we ask ourselves, okay, we really want to get back within planetary boundaries. We've made pledges nationally, internationally. We want to get back within sustainability, and the debate is how to do this. Some people argue that we won't have to sacrifice economic growth and that we can keep growing everything while just managing to do that. The evidence I've shown in the previous slides, which are starting to be better studied in the whole scientific literature, is showing us that these expectations of green growth are not realistic. If you cannot green growth, that leaves you one single option: to degrow. That's the temporary phase of economic construction you see in phase 2. So imagine this as a kind of macroeconomic diet. So temporary because it's not going to last forever, otherwise your economy disappear, which would be pretty stupid. And also diet because it's selective and progressive. The goal, of course, is to identify the sectors, the goods and services, the producer, the consumers, the regions that are very heavy in the national ecological footprint, and to contract these in a logic of sufficiency, in a logic of acting directly on demand and on supply in order to just accelerate or kickstart the reduction in footprint. So you do this until you get back into the green, because at the end of the day, that's the goal. We don't do this for fun. We do this to actually get back into the green as fast as possible to minimize environmental degradation. Once you're there, you enter into the third phase, which is a different mode of economic organizations we don't often hear about. Steady state, the steady state economy. And so the idea here is to have an economy that for its growth phase was very much focused on quantity and volume, building stuff, producing and consuming more. During degrowth, you had the macroeconomic diet, and during the steady state, your economy remains biophysically stable in terms of the use of natural resources, but that economy can continue to evolve in terms of the quality of what it produces. So you could say, in the same way that our human bodies have a growth phase during childhood and teenagehood, then our body stabilizes in terms of weight and centimeters. I'm still 180, and I was 180 10 years ago when I was in my 20s, and I suspect I will be 180 centimeters in 10 years when I'll be in my 40s. And yet I've been evolving. I have more friends and knowledge and experiences. An economy is the very same thing. We need to shift from a quantity-based, growth-based economy to a quality-based, steady-state economy. That is the challenge. And so now let's put this picture with the two different types of countries we've been seeing from the beginning. We have high-income countries that are in a very advanced state of ecological overshoot. These countries, they do not manage to reduce their footprint, or they do not manage to reduce it fast enough to get back in the green. So they will have to somehow produce and consume less. That will have to be planned, organized, orchestrated, selective, progressive. It's a challenge to organize. It's something we've never been doing before, but so far there is no scientific evidence that we can do without it. This is so important to do it because, as we've seen, high-income countries are today using the majority of natural resources, which leaves no resources for the development of the global south. Think of the global carbon budget. It's limited. You can only emit a certain number of tons, otherwise you warm the climate. A ton you emit here in Tallinn, in Luxembourg, in France, is a ton that won't be emitted in other countries that might need it more because it has to either develop or just adapt to the consequences of global warming that is already here. So here you can see these two strategies, they're connected. Degrowth in high-income countries is going to liberate natural resources that can be used for growth in low-income countries. And these two movements lead exactly in the same place, in these biophysical steady-state economy I've been describing, which we can refer to here as post-growth. So we have the diet-enriched countries, and we have this extra nourishment in poorer countries that each, after some point, must transition to the very same mode of economic organization, which is to manage to just optimize, secure, guarantee well-being within planetary boundaries. At the end of the day, an economy that is not doing this is an economy that is not working. And so now you're going to tell me, okay, well, we understand that, but what does that have to do with capitalism? And capitalism is just a name we use in economics to make the difference between different economic systems. And here I would say that capitalism, in its most ideal typical state, is an economic system that is made of 4 features and 1 rule. Capitalism in itself, I mean, you hear it in the name, is a system that maximizes the accumulation of capital. Capital is the mobilization of a resource to produce a surplus. And today that surplus is very often taking the form of financial returns. So that is basically the rule of the game of capitalism. If you manage to generate financial returns faster than others, you win. You get more wealth, and then you can appropriate new resources, reinvest them, turn them into more capital, and accumulate even wealth faster. This is how the game functions, and it functions with 4 very simple features. The first one is the for-profit business. If you want to accumulate and maximize the speed of financial returns, it makes sense to have this kind of Darwinian competition between for-profit companies. And the companies the most lucrative, they're the one that must win. And the least lucrative, they must disappear. And so over time, we have this kind of competition around lucrativity. And if every single business strives to grow, guess what happens at the macroeconomic level? That grows the economy as a whole, with all the environmental consequences we've seen. So that's one feature. A second feature is, in order to just really maximize that capital, you must have the private ownership of the means of production. Because somehow, if that's a competitive game where you compete against others, you must make a difference between, that is my forest and I'm maximizing the financial returns of my forest for my own benefits versus your forest. If it's just our forest or Mother Earth forest, then it doesn't work. So another feature is to make sure that the means of production are very well privatized. A third feature has to do with the predominance of market exchange as a means of allocation. Allocation in economics is the way the resources move around. And today in a capitalist system, to make sure that we maximize financial returns, we tend to commodify certain things, to turn them into potential goods and services that could be sold. Again, that's a mode of allocation that works well if you want to maximize growth, but sometimes that has a lot of drawbacks. And the fourth feature is the predominance of wage labor. So again, another thing that must be commodified is time itself as to fit within this kind of growth-based monetary economy. Now, when I say escape from capitalism, I think the goal itself is incompatible with sustainability, because what we want is not to maximize financial returns. What we want is to, secure well-being within planetary boundaries. And if we want to do this, so changing the rule of the game, the one that wins is not the one that's got the most money. The one that wins is the one that has best secured well-being within planetary boundaries, which we realize it turns a competitive game into a cooperative game, because that respect of planetary boundaries can only be achieved together. And if we want to do this, we need to tweak the game. So that does not mean completely scrapping the economy and bringing a shiny new one. It means we need to slightly change these 4 core features of a capitalist economy. So for example, we need to go from for-profit business to not-for-profit entrepreneurship. It's the very same thing. We keep producing and consuming and innovating and finding solutions to better meet unmet needs, just like we've always done within all economic systems. The difference is that we make sure that these activities cannot be done solely informed by profit making, which unfortunately today is slowing down the ecological transition, because most of the things we need to invest to in ecological regeneration and the unmet needs of the one at the bottom of the income distribution, unfortunately, are the least lucrative investment you could have today. That's why we don't see them happening. But if you take away the profit motive, then you give so much more agility to businesses that can finally tackle these missions that, even though they're not lucrative in terms of money, they are extremely useful in terms of well-being. Just a couple of examples of the things I've been talking about. Instead of trying to turn everything into a commodity so it can fit within this kind of monetary competition, we can use other means of allocation to make sure that scarce natural resources can not only be bought and sold, but sometimes just directly used and shared more broadly using specific institutions. And that's what I refer to as common ownership of the means, not only of production, but of contentment. To be like certain ecosystems that provide services without which we could not live: purification of air, of water, the thriving of species, and all the services they provide. And so therefore we need to assume a common ownership of that ecological wealth. That is not an instrument certain individuals can use to become rich. No, that's too important for that. It's a core feature of any well-functioning economy, and so therefore that becomes a common. Same thing having to do with work. We cannot today wait for the market and for-profit businesses to create the kind of jobs we need to make that green economy emerge. So we need to find ways of gaining more agility collectively to create these jobs that we dearly need, not only to organize the transition from peoples in the contracting sectors of the economy that will have to find new jobs, but also to invent the jobs of that future economy, where again we're maximizing not lucrativity, but well-being. And so there's going to be plenty of jobs in ecological regeneration, which is not going to be lucrative because, again, nature doesn't have a wallet. Trees and bees, they're not going to wire you money once you save them or just rebuild their habitat. And yet, there is tremendous value in that work. So today we need to really reopen our vision of value. And that's really the choice we have in between collapse, like this terrifying French TV show from the 2019, waiting in this kind of denial, the denial of green growth, that somehow we face resource scarcity and collapsing ecosystems and have to contract our economies in a state of panic. This I want to avoid at all cost. The alternative would be degrowth that we start right now. Will be before being forced to do so, we organize our own downscaling of production and consumption to make sure it is fair, to make sure it is democratic, to make sure it is convivial, and to make sure it leads to this kind of post-growth economy where, again, the very central goal is securing well-being within planetary boundaries. So that's the choice we have. And today, some people are telling us about the pragmatism of economic reality and how important it is. Every time you hear about economic laws and the market and whatever, I want you to remember about Jumanji. The economy is a game, we've built it, we've constructed every single institution of it was a human decision. And so therefore, we have the collective power to pose it, to modify it, to reform, and even to change the very objective and rules of the game.
Thank you, Timothy. We have a few questions. The first question. Oh. Timothy, how you have changed. Into the Joseph. Okay. We have a few questions. The first question is from the audience, and it's, what's the first necessary step towards degrowth? The first one.
I mean, my favorite one would be to just forget the recipe of GDP and just measure the things we're really trying to increase. Life expectancy, democracy, quality of public services, whatever you want, and measure the thing we're really trying to decrease. So, artificialization of soil, material footprint, greenhouse gases. Let's measure concrete things and not rely too much on economic abstraction.
Okay. I think in Nepal there's not GDP, but GDP of happiness. They have their own currency for that. Next question: what is missing that we have not accepted this idea of degrowth as a mainstream idea already?
I think we still believe that somehow economic growth is a sign of prosperity. But when you dissect what economic growth is, let's say over a year, you realize that sometimes it is an economic growth, we call it. It generates more social and ecological cost than benefits. So we have fallen in love with this idea of an economy must always be growing. And we need to really do away with what has become an ideology, a very commonsensical thing to say. Like, even if you don't know what economic growth, people you ask in the street, they like it. They want it because they think it's going to improve their lives. True thing? No. Sometimes economic growth can be beneficial, like right now in global south countries. And in other contexts, it can be detrimental. So we really need, again, to come back to more concrete objectives.
And the last question, if an amateur like me would, because I like to be led by example, if I'm interested in topic, who are the persons or the companies that I can follow to see the degrowth in action?
So you're going to be disappointed because, you know, I talk as a scientist today, so I can tell you there's a thriving literature. There's more than 1,000 peer-reviewed articles on the topic of degrowth since 2007. There's just numerous books and really inspiring scholars, especially the youngest generation that have been using that concept, developing scenarios, concept theories, trying to find little examples here and there in small companies, in small cities, in small countries that have tried stuff like Bhutan, as you mentioned, with the growth national happiness. So there is a thriving literature which I think could inspire people in this room to try things you've never tried before. Because at the end of the day, this is really what we need to do today. We're faced with the failure of previous strategies. So the grand contest for new ideas should be declared open.
Okay, thank you, Timothy. Give a round of applause for Timothy. We hope to see you next time here on stage physically. Please do leave a feedback for this session just by scanning the QR code or doing so in Brella. We will have 10 happy and lucky people who gives the feedback will get the tickets for next year's festival. Now we're going into a small commercial break and we will be back in 5 minutes with another great speaker. But you can as well explore the other stages. So we will be back in 5 minutes. See you then.